Let me know when.
Life events, Rene.
Yeah, yeah.
It's fun, but
Okay, I have a message that we're live now. Okay, well, good afternoon for those of you in Europe and probably Africa. I know that we have an audience from various parts of the world. And I would like to welcome today Sergio Almecija for our second talk of the season with Primate Conversations. And I'm getting some feedback here, so I just have to close the window. And good morning to you in North America, Sergio, and those of you in North and South America, where it's earlier, much earlier in the day. It's a real pleasure to have today Sergio Almecija with us. Sergio is a senior research scientist in biological anthropology at the American Museum of Natural History in New York City. Sergio is a paleoanthropologist and evolutionary morphologist, and he has been studying now for quite some time some of the key adaptations that define the hominin lineage, as well as looking at some of our immediate ancestors among the large array of Miocene apes. Sergio has his PhD from the Miquel Cruzafront Catalan Institute of Paleontology and the University of Barcelona, and a very extensive record of publishing on a whole variety of hominin taxa, from some of the Miocene apes to Ororhyntugenensis, as well as a species of Australopithecus. And today we have the honor to have Sergio speak to us about fossil apes and human evolution. And I leave you with our guest. Just one note for those of you in the audience, if you have questions that you would like to ask Sergio, if you write them down in the chat function in YouTube, then at the end of his talk, we will try to bring up these questions to Sergio so that we can discuss them. So thank you, Sergio, and we're all yours.
Well, thank you very much, Rene, for such a nice introduction and for inviting me to be part of this great seminar series. I'm really delighted to be here. Hello, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are. So I just like to start by saying that I love good stories, and every good story has a great beginning. And to me, one of the most interesting beginnings of any story is basically the origins of the human lineage. And the human lineage, as far as we know today, originated from some mystery ape around the end of the Miocene, between 9 to 6 million years ago. So basically, this talk is about understanding what do we know today about this mysterious ancestor from which both humans on the one hand and chimpanzees on the other evolved. And how can we use everything we know about living apes, but also fossil apes, to kind of fill different gaps in the big puzzle of human origins. And what I'm going to be presenting today is a version of this review on the topic that my colleagues and I here on the right from different institutions in the US and in Catalonia and Spain put together earlier this year. So if you want to know more, I invite you to go read this review, because we put a lot of effort in trying to provide an overall picture of our ideas. This is going to be like a my summary of it. This year is a great year to talk about this, because exactly 150 years ago is when Darwin first hypothesized about the nature of these ancestors, the early ancestors of humans, the human lineage in general, of the hominins. He hypothesized about where that could have originated. And so he just, based on gross anatomical comparisons done by other people like Huxley, he thought that it probably was likely that the human lineage originated somewhere in Africa, because this is where African apes, gorillas, and chimpanzees live today. But he also was very cautious because at the time, the only known to the public fossil ape at the time from the Miocene time was Dryopithecus, who had been found just over a decade before in France. So he basically said, but this is just a speculation. Let's wait until we find more fossils because we only have one. He also this is all on the same page in The Descent of Man. He also warned us against trying to basically write down the story of human evolution based on what we can see today. He warned us that perhaps that early ancestor of the human lineage was not something that looked exactly like any of the living primates today. So I was 150 years ago. Today we have much more information. We have genetic information. There are plenty of field studies of how living apes like live, eat, move around. We have their genetic information. We have many more fossils. And we have figured out some key aspects. We found some key puzzles, like pieces of the puzzle. For example, right until like in the 1960s, we still didn't have a good idea of the relationships among living hominoids, like the ape and human clade. And this is just an example of the 1930s, but the picture was similar still in the 50s and the 60s until the first molecular studies that basically showed that what we thought was not exactly what we thought. For example, before using gross overall morphological similarities, the idea was that all the living great apes, orangutans, chimpanzees, gorillas, were a natural group, a clade. Perhaps hylobatids were a little more distantly related, and humans have like diverged early on from this great ape group. This is just an example. Like other researchers actually thought that humans were so different because they diverged much early on from other primate ancestors. Well, today we know, based on just full genome comparisons, that actually the closest living relative of humans are chimpanzees, including bonobos. Together, the great apes and humans are the hominid family, the hominidae, that together with the lesser apes, the hylobatids, we are the superfamily the hominoids. And chimpanzees and humans, as I said, share a last common ancestor, or LCA, that based on molecular clock estimates, lived around 9 to 6 million years ago. But there's still some things that are completely not resolved. They're heavily debated still today, and such things about the nature of this last common ancestor of humans and chimpanzees are basic, essential things such as where this split between the two lineages occur, how these last common ancestors look like, or how these last common ancestors move around. And so we have several challenges still today that we need to solve in order to answer those questions. I'm going to point out some of them. An important one is just the distribution of what we see today and what was in the past. It's really different, and that makes us it's basically some fossils don't fit some of the evolutionary scenarios that we're contemplating today to understand the origins of the human clade. Here we have the distribution of living hominoids on Earth. You can see hylobatids and orangutans live in the Southeast Asia. And then we have chimpanzees and gorillas living in basically Central Africa around the Ecuador and nearby regions. So still today, we contemplate in most textbooks the idea, this evolutionary scenario about the origins of hominins when they, as how they split from chimpanzees, based in the East Side story, which was actually conceived in the 90s, and it made a lot of sense then because then we already knew that humans and chimpanzees share last common ancestor. The earliest fossils of the human lineage that we had, such as Australopithecus, were found in Eastern Africa. And so this evolutionary scenario basically pointed out that, well, as the Great Rift Valley developed during the Miocene, a group of apes, was the ancestral population of chimpanzees and humans, got stranded east of the Rift Valley. The climate there was the environment become more seasonal and open, and it was less tree coverage. So this poor ape basically was forced to adopt a new kind of locomotion, basically terrestrial bipedalism. And this idea also points out that perhaps this ancestor of chimpanzees and humans look pretty much like a chimpanzee today. And the reason for that idea is that, well, if chimpanzees live in the environment in which that ancestor used to live, the selective pressures haven't changed much. So perhaps that ancestor is closer reflected when we see chimpanzees today. Chimpanzees basically have not changed a lot, at least physically, from what that ancestor looked like. But you know, it's been around 30 years since then, and now we have more fossils that make us, or should make us reconsider some of these. For example, we have, those stars are sites with Miocene apes that we know today. Not sites, but regions with sites. Some of these stars represent several sites in the same region. And as you can tell from just looking quickly here, the distribution of living African apes, that's not much what we know about the distribution of fossil apes during the Miocene. So during the time and before, from which chimpanzees and humans diverged from each other. We still have some potential early hominins, so members of the human lineage, that are very old. They live towards the end of the Miocene, which basically lasted until 5.3 million years ago, in Eastern Africa. But there are also other contenders living farther west and north, like Sahelanthropus in the Chad, or even Grecopithecus and Organopithecus in Greece have been pointed out as potential ancestors of the human lineage. So, I mean, those fossils, not everyone agrees that they are hominins. That's I want to clarify that. But no matter what, we still have Australopithecus barrel-ghazali from Chad as well. And as far as I know, everyone agrees that this is a clear hominin. So for sure, there were hominins that were not living, the early hominins that were not living eastern or southern on the Rift Valley. So there is, and if we consider where the fossil apes that we have used to live in the Miocene, basically we cannot, there is not a strong evidence that this East Side Story scenario still holds strongly today. We have another challenge, which is just anatomy. The apes today look different from the apes in the past. Here on the bottom, we have the outline of a skeleton of a chimpanzee representing a modern hominoid body plan. On top, we have the same for the macaque. And all living hominoids have what is called an orthograde or upright body plan. We have the shoulder blades on the back, the torso is wide and shallow. Here we have a cranial view. On top we have that of a macaque. On the bottom we have that of a chimpanzee. See, there are clear differences also in the morphology of the lumbar vertebra. Like monkeys have these transverse processes arising from the body, pointing downwards, and in modern hominoids, they arise, and especially great apes, they arise on the pedicle and point upwards. This relates to the size of the muscles that go in this region, in the dorsal side of the back, the paxial muscles. Basically, these relate to things such as shortening and stiffness of the back, of the lower back in modern hominoids that relate to this orthograde posture that is seen as an adaptation for orthograde behaviors, upright behaviors. Those include climbing trees in a particular way, what is called vertical climbing, or suspending below the branches, like below branch suspension, or even walking bipedally is a type of orthograde behavior, different from the pronograde or on the floor, on the ground morphology and associated locomotion and postures that we see in most monkeys today. That's the primitive body plan that we also see like in cats, dogs, other animals. To the right, we have some examples of modern hominoids, and they all share the overall orthograde structure that I just described here. So if we only look at living hominoids and try to infer how the last ancestor of all of them look like, I mean, it makes sense to assume that that ancestor was already orthograde and had that overall orthograde morphology. But things get a little more complicated when we have a look to the fossil ape record. During the Miocene, what other people have called the real planet of the apes, things don't look exactly as we would expect based on what we see looking at modern hominoids today. For example, some of the earlier forms that we have of apes is a Kembo from Kenya 8 million years ago. Most reconstructions indicate that it looked basically from the distance, it would look like a pronograde monkey. The big difference, no tail. So probably some changes already in how it was moving above the branches or even on the ground as compared to a monkey. Some joints look a little more in the hominoid-like side of things, so they indicate a little more range of motion as compared to many monkeys. A little later in time, we have other apes such as Nachalopithecus, 40 million years ago, Kenya, which from a distance would look like some sort of a Kembo, like the previous form, but some aspects of the face look a little more like a modern great ape, and some joints, especially on the forelimb, seem large as compared to the hind limb. So some researchers think that these kind of apes indicate that some aspect related to more forelimb dominated behaviors have evolved already in this kind of form. Another example of a strange ape from the Miocene is Shivapithecus from 12 to 9 million years ago in India and Pakistan. You can clearly see that it shares clear similarities with the face of a modern orangutan. Things get more complicated when we look at some of the postcranial bones that have been attributed to this taxon. For example, if we look at the humerus, there's a 3 partial humeri from Shivapithecus. They look curved like a baboon and not straight like modern hominoids or a living orangutan especially. So what is going on? This is basically homoplasty. And here is a homoplasty dilemma, because homoplasty just means false homology, meaning similarities that are not homologous. They have evolved independently in different branches of the tree. So if Shivapithecus, whatever it is, has either evolved facial similarities with orangutans, in parallel with orangutans, and is not related to orangutans, or it's part of the orangutan lineage, and that's what has similarities in the face. But if that's the case, then the humeri indicate, and other parts of the body, that the similarities that we see in living hominoids today might have evolved independently through homoplasty. So one way or another, there is homoplasty evolution happening, and it makes things difficult to figure out what is really going on. Another example is Spirolopithecus. This is one of the dryopid apes from Europe, particularly from Spain, this particular genus. And this is an interesting specimen because the overall, which is a partial skeleton, so we can kind of figure out the overall shape of its body. The face looks very similar to a modern great ape, with some still primitive features, though. Based on the clavicle and the ribs and even the lumbar vertebra, we think that it had already an orthograde body plan. Here you see the transfer processes are broken on the vertebra, but they arise kind of in the middle, similar to, not in the body like primitive form, but kind of in a higher position, more like living hominoids, especially like hylobatids, the gibbons and siamang from Southeast Asia. But what is interesting is that then we look at the hand, and we cannot really reconstruct how long the thumb was yet as compared to the other fingers, but the overall hand length relative to the size of the body, it was more similar to something more primitive like an Akembo than to like a modern orangutan or a chimpanzee in which the fingers are elongated. At the same time, the wrist bones look kind of primitive for some features, but other features suggest enhanced range of motion as well, probably related to enhanced like climbing capabilities. So basically, the overall signal here is mosaic evolution. Different parts of the body that we see, like something that we see as a pack in living hominoids, might have evolved in different regions at different times, not together as a pack. So other examples. This is also from the same region where Pilolopithecus is found, a little younger in time. From the distance, this skeleton is being claimed to look like an orangutan, because it's super long forelimbs as compared to the hind limbs, but other aspects of the morphology are not orangutan at all. So this suggests that even like an orangutan skeleton, like the shape of an orangutan skeleton, which is adapted or seen as an adaptation to climb a lot, hang below the branches a lot, could have evolved also independently. I can discuss details of the different apes I'm mentioning at the end of the talk. I'm just gonna now focus on the overall picture. Now we move a little closer to the end of the Miocene. We have something like Ororhyntugerensis in Kenya, which could be an early hominin because some features of the femur relate to being a biped. But what is interesting is that there is several studies showing that it's likely some sort of biped. On a morphometric study that I conducted with my team actually showed that in overall shape, this femur is intermediate between Australopithecus afarensis, like Lucy, and something really primitive such as an akembo, and very different from something like a chimpanzee. So that it's interesting because maybe some parts of the body in the human lineage evolved from a morphology that is more closely represented today in fossils that predated the human chimpanzee speed than any of the living apes. Interesting from this skeleton is that we have this little phalanx it's a distal phalanx of the thumb attributed to Ororhyn, and it's interesting because it pretty much looks like the thumb bone of Australopithecus as well, which is it's similar to some regards to even modern humans because it has a well-developed pulp and it's wide, and probably had like a long, like a insertion for a long flexor muscle, different from living apes as well. So perhaps was good at manipulation 6 million years ago already. Then we have things like Ardipithecus ramidus. This is also an early hominin, or a likely early hominin. It's early Pliocene, no, so it's after the Miocene. And it's also a very interesting specimen because it's been reconstructed by the original team as being similar to something primitive such as an akembo in terms of overall proportions and posture. Here we have reconstruction, but more recent studies indicate that it's a mix. Like some aspects of the hand are more like a chimpanzee, but the hand proportions are more like an akembo, a primitive form. The overall limb proportions are also primitive, but some aspects of the foot could also basically be closely represented by living chimpanzees or even gorillas, depending on which aspect of the morphology we're looking at. So again, this mosaic that makes things complicated when we try to put all together to have an overall, like understand an overall signal of how it was moving, where it falls in the tree, etc. So we have several challenges here. The ape distribution is different in the past and in the present. The anatomies of the past are different from the anatomies in the present, and then we add the fragmentary nature of the fossil record is only partial skeletons or fragments of different bones. We never had a nice, clean skeleton. We have homoplasty, which is false homology, things evolving independently several times. And we had also mosaic evolution, things that we would infer looking from the present that have evolved together may have evolved at different times. Makes things even more difficult and create other challenges, such as, for example, reconstructing the evolutionary role of the different fossil species. This figure, I know it's very busy, but just let me break it down. Here we have the living hominoids by genus, so hylobatids, orangutans, gorillas, chimpanzees, humans, and a selection of the different fossil apes from the Miocene, just indicating with color code the likely position. And the main point here is to show that there is no real consensus. Here we have in green fossils from Africa, and in purple from Asia, and in this golden color from Europe. And here I'm highlighting all this group here, what are called the dryopids. We don't know if they're a real clade or they are just apes that live in Europe and they came at different times and they are not related really to each other. But it's interesting that because we have so many fossils in Europe, and we don't have during that time, basically the end of the middle Miocene and the late Miocene, we don't have almost fossilites, or we have so many in Europe. People is focusing their attention, many researchers are focusing their attention in these fossils, because one idea out there is that perhaps those are ancestors of the whole great ape and human group, or specifically of the African apic human group or the orangutan group, because we don't have clear fossils that go in any of these positions. Here, this is what these arrows mean. And again, these are not just different opinions. Those are conclusions reached from different cladistic studies looking at the same bones. But as you know, it's just this lack of consensus just reflect the complexity of what we're looking at. And something that is very important here is that there is almost no fossils, virtually no fossils that clearly fall in the gorilla lineage or clearly fall in the chimpanzee lineage, which makes it very difficult to figure it out exactly how these nodes look like and tease apart which ones are after the node in the human side or in the chimpanzee side or at the base here before they split or in the base of the gorilla or the base of the whole group. It's hard to tell that because we don't have the fossils of this region. But more challenges is because the morphology is so complicated, it's hard to figure out the function. And just as an example, let's use Australopithecus afarensis, Lucy. Lucy was found in the 70s. We have many more partial bones, even partial skeletons, juvenile, male adult, hundreds of individual bones. And still today, there is no agreement in the community about how exactly it was moving. For example, this is just simplifying things. There's a school of thought of researchers that my colleagues and I call the totalists. And totalists would just look at the overall pattern, overall morphological pattern. Something like Lucy, like afarensis, clearly has features on the hind limb that indicate it was a very committed biped, but at the same time is retaining primitive features such as curved fingers and a scapula that looks similar to a gorilla. So therefore was both a biped on the ground and a good climber, even suspensory primate on the trees. Another school of thought is what my colleagues and I call the directionalists. And researchers working under that paradigm look at things a little different. They consider that the primitive features, like in this case, those related to being an arboreal primate, should not be taken into consideration to reconstruct the functional morphology of fossil species, because they're just primitive retentions that don't play an active role. They didn't play an active role during the life of these species. And we should just focus on what the target of selection was at the time when that species was alive. And they would, in this case, focus only on the biped traits. It's really hard to tell which one is right. Maybe it's one way in one fossil and something works in a different way in a different fossil, but we just don't know today. And these affects a lot the hominoid fossil record, and especially fossilites from the Miocene, because they are so more fragmentary and bizarre that there is no agreement. And just as an example, here we have one paleontologist, Johannes Arceler, was working with Italian miners. This is in 1958, looking at the scene of the mine. They were just where they had just found something really cool, which is this pretty complete, partially articulated skeleton of a hominoid, that Sandrone. It was a young male, and it was bizarre because before, most of what was known about this ape was based on isolated teeth. Here you have an example. They look so weird that for many years, some researchers considered Aureopithecus not to be a hominid at all, but perhaps being a fossil oval monkey, or even a fossil suite back even earlier. And it looks from the distance now that has this orthograde body plan, looks similar to some degree to some of the living apes, but it has its own idiosyncrasies. And because the only agreement is that it was an orthograde ape, different reconstructions by different teams reconstruct Aureopithecus as being a climber, as being a suspensory ape, or even as being a biped. This is the actual reconstruction of Aureopithecus in the museum in Florence. If you go there to see the original fossils, this is what you're going to see. Those are all behaviors that are basically derived from being an orthograde hominoid. And today we still don't have the tools to really tease apart which behavior was dominant. So moving on, we need to fill some gaps in our knowledge. And basically what my colleagues and I are being pointing out is that we should just look at everything that we can look at, right? Some colleagues like to focus more on what is being described as the top-down view. Like we have living apes today and humans and other primates, we have their genes. We know where they live. We know what they eat. We should look at them to understand the relationships between form, function, diet, life history, and such. And there are an extreme view of these like top-down approaches that fossils are we really don't know exactly where they form the tree. Their morphology is hard to understand. They might not even be related to any of the living hominoids as far as we know. So some colleagues prefer not to even bring them into the picture. On the other extreme of the spectrum, the bottom-up view is, well, clearly if you look at the Mayas and you look, we know there were like 50 plus genera of apes living like in all the old world. And we have so few of them today. So perhaps what we have today is they're just remnants. It's a much larger group of hominoids, and they look similar because they survive by evolving similar adaptations to live in the increasingly fragmented forest that we have today around the tropic. So perhaps they don't represent really what was going on during the time of the split on humans and chimpanzees. And basically, I think a larger community thinks that we should just look at both ways. We should just look at everything we can from the living primates and everything we can from the fossil ones, because this is a four-dimensional puzzle and every piece counts. And we need to acknowledge the limitations of looking at a very small sample of living hominoids. We also need to acknowledge the limitations of looking only from the past from fossils that we don't really understand their function or phylogenetic position. Especially, we don't have a lot of the important fossils that we should have. For example, there are not clear fossils from the gorilla chimpanzee lineage, which they are hindering our reconstructions of these last common ancestors of humans and chimpanzees, or even the whole African ape and human clade. So we need to do more research in living primates. And here, I just want to highlight that living primates are really complex animals. Everyone who studies them knows that you cannot classify them as herbivore, carnivore, climber, suspensory, terrestrial, quadruped. They have very complex locomotor behaviors. And what is interesting is that humans, if anything, they show us that humans are not either that group of apes that just evolved into a biped. Bipedalism in some form, either as a posture, as a locomotion, exists to some degree in living primates today. So likely that ancestor of humans and chimpanzee also exhibited some degree of bipedal postures and locomotion. What happened in the human lineage is that those locomotor behaviors and postures become more and more dominant over time in their overall locomotor repertoire, and other locomotor behaviors disappear over time. But what is interesting to me is that we study fossils, including myself here, and try to reconstruct an ancestor that we don't even have fossils for today as being suspensory, or as being a knuckle walker, or no, it was already like partially biped, or no, it was mostly a clamberer. And it's interesting that we don't have that information for some living primates, including gorillas. There is no comparable data for gorillas yet, in terms of when you try to parse down from the total locomotor repertoire what is doing. We don't have that information of gorillas as compared to other species of hominoids today. And this is an animal that we can go and study in the field. I know there are studies ongoing that are filling these gaps right now, but today that data is not available. So these are animals that we have today, and we don't have that information yet. We quickly predict exactly how these ancestors look like and move around. And I think it's kind of funny. We should acknowledge how far can we go with what we have today. And I want to finish early so we can discuss. So before that, I just want to move to this slide and just point out that we really need more fossils, because of course we can use the fossils that we have today to put together a story or evolutionary scenarios that make sense with what we have today. But of course, every time we have new fossils, those evolutionary scenarios need to change, need to keep updating themselves. And I think it's interesting that the range in which we find chimpanzees and gorillas today is a range in where we know no fossil apes. And here we have few outliers of sites with fossiliates found outside Eastern Africa. And those are all sites identified by French teams that seem to like basically move out of the way from what other people is looking at. And there, if anything, they show us that we're making a study based on what we have like either in Eastern Africa or in Europe, but perhaps we're just using the fossils that we have. And that doesn't mean that those are the fossils that we need. And clearly there were fossils somewhere else, and we just don't have them yet. So I think we should always take that into consideration when we put together our theories of hominin origins, or even just great ape evolution in general. So we need to find more fossils as always, but we also need to find more fossils from more sites for places where people is not looking for. And I think other people, I know some folks such as Rene and Susana are already doing that. And I think other guys are also doing the same. But we still are far, I think, from understanding what was the distribution of not just apes, but hominins during the late Miocene and even early Pliocene. We know that, perhaps there were hominins living in Western Africa or even Northern Africa. And that would change dramatically the idea that we have today of how the split of chimpanzees and humans happen. And with that, I just want to say thank you to everyone for your attention, and I like to just hear your questions and discuss.
Thank you so much, Sergio. It's an absolutely fascinating topic, fascinating discussion. And like you mentioned, much of what you presented is in this really good article in Science, a review paper that has a lot of information, very, very nicely synthesizing all kinds of lines of evidence. But thank you so much for that. We do have some questions for you, if I may, and let me start with. You began to talk about this mystery ape in the late Miocene, so between 9 and 6 million years, as very likely giving rise to hominids. Now, focusing for a moment on the timing of this divergence between the human lineage and our closest living relatives. From bringing together the fossil evidence, the molecular evidence, and so on, can we do better than saying anything between 9 and 6 million years ago? And part of this question has to do with both the early part of that time frame as well as the late part. And given that we have hominids, and again, based on your talk, I think Auroran and Ardipithecus and probably Sahelanthropus very likely are hominids. If these are hominids, then shouldn't we just drop that 6 million year date and think about the time of the split happening clearly before that, and how far back? Still a question of debate. What are your thoughts on that, Sergio?
I mean, I just that number just to simplify, but the latest estimates, molecular clock estimates, are wider. They're and more restrictive on the so it would be more like from 9, I think 9.3 to something like 6.5. And so like 6.5 would be like the minimum, right? And again, I agree that that's just based on molecular clock estimates, and we need to include the fossils to be more accurate. But it's hard because then we need to start making assumptions about, okay, which of the fossils that we have are clearly hominids. And if Sahelanthropus, this is an example, it's for sure a hominin, and it's 7 million years ago, then we should already say 9.7 or 9.3 to 7, for example, right? I know, I agree. But this is just my personal opinion, is that we need more fossils of Sahelanthropus and more dating work on Sahelanthropus to make sure that it's really 7 and it's really a hominin. Because today we're mostly assuming that anything around that time period that it's a biped, it's a hominin. But something like Sahelanthropus, continue with the same example, we don't know for sure it was a biped. Like there are some postcranial bones coming out. They are not fully described. They are fragmentary in the case of the femur, for example. I'm not convinced it was a biped. And even if it was a biped, well, we are assuming that bipedalism or some sort of like increased bipedal locomotion just happened once in human lineage. But I don't think that needs to be necessarily the case either.
Staying on Sahelanthropus and its possible hominin status, what about the canine teeth? Would these fit into what we would consider an early hominin? I know that the postcrania, as you mentioned, the femur has been controversial. But...
So I'm not prepared to answer the question because I haven't seen the originals, and I almost know no one who's seen the originals. So everything is based on what is published. As far as I know, the canines are not well preserved. We're talking about inferred canine size based on the alveolar shape and whatever is preserved of the roots, which is being done with other fossils as well. But again, we are in that game of if, then hominin. And I'm not saying it was not a hominin. I'm saying that we need more, and we need everyone to be able to access the actual fossils to make up their own minds before we can conclude it's a hominin.
You also mentioned bipedalism and the idea that even if Sahelanthropus was bipedal, that doesn't necessarily mean it was a hominin, or that we can classify it within the hominin clade. But that doesn't that go against the whole idea that bipedalism is such an odd adaptation for primates that is somewhat unlikely that it would have evolved multiple times, even in these very diverse late Miocene apes.
Yeah, my answer basically is I don't think it's likely that they evolved more than once, but I don't think it's impossible either. And if bipedalism, like knuckle walking in chimpanzees and gorillas, evolved at some point during the Miocene basically as a way to allow an orthograde ape to move better terrestrially in more open environment, more fragmented environments. If that is the case, then they're just both valid solutions to the same problem. So I don't know why it could not evolve more than once. And there are like people like Kevin Hunt studying another researchers are studying the savanna chimpanzees, and they're supposed to be more biped than other chimpanzee populations, right? And even there's I know some research showing that they even have like more valgus knee and things like that. So I'm not defending that it's likely that bipedalism will evolve more than once, but I just there's a discussion of whether or not knuckle walking evolved once or twice in between chimpanzees and gorillas. I think putting all our chips on this is a hominin based on it has these features suggesting that it could be a biped as the way to diagnose a hominin, because many times it's being a biped, it's reflected in several parts of the body, right? And if you only have one of those parts of the body, and you only can measure that, and you actually compare with a large sample of living primates, usually that metric on your fossil falls always in intermediate regions between something that you could see in a chimpanzee or a bonobo and a human. So why was a biped? I think basically it's hard to find clear cuts in terms of morphometrics. It's easy to identify clear cut of modern human and other things, but not of early hominins. As you know, like Australopithecus, for most metrics, falls somewhere in between African apes and humans, or other fossil apes, you include them in the equation as well. So it's kind of blurry. It's just, I'm not saying it was not a hominin again. I'm just using this as a clear example of a fossil that could be, but we don't have enough fossils yet from representing different parts of the body of different individuals. We don't even are not sure about the age. The fossils are not really open to study. So it's just, we need to wait. I think it's great to consider it. Look, we have something, no matter what, it's interesting that we have that fossil. But we should be, I think, open-minded to the possibility that it might be something else.
Yeah, you mentioned a couple of times, Sergio, the necessity to have fossils available for study once they've been published, of course, and studied by the discoverers. And that, from what you are saying, remains a major problem in the study of human origins, although it's not limited to that, but the inaccessibility of some of this fossil material. I don't know if you want to comment on that, or can move on to the next question.
Well, it's just, no, I don't need to dwell on it. Just that it was not a direct attack. It's just even some fossils are available to study, but they're not like restudied many times. It happens a lot that sometimes a fossil is described as analyzed by a particular team, and then once that's published, it's like assumed that those conclusions are solid. But then it happens that years later, someone else has a look to the same fossils with different perspective, different sample, different analysis that was not available before, that can refine some things better. And they came up with a slightly different conclusion, or very different conclusion. So it's more, so of course, if only one thing can see a fossil, that makes things even harder, which I think is the case particularly of Sahelanthropus, because I don't know anyone who studied the originals except the original discoverers. But that's like I don't know any other, because even other fossils like Ardipithecus, I know other people who had seen them, at least they'd seen them. But that's a clear example of a fossil that no one is really, so we need to be able to, the independent teams, to look at the same fossils with fresher eyes and different samples to come out and see. Like, my point is, if different people with different approaches reach similar conclusions, it seems like a solid, like it's more, whether it's A or B, it's solid. But right now we're not there yet with some fossils.
Agree. Now, another question, Sergio, it's similar to the question about bipedalism. Bipedalism, the idea that it's something that may have evolved few times just because it's so unusual among primates. You've talked about knuckle walking, and there's also been this idea that in your talk you mentioned it's not correct that that knuckle walking is something that was evolved in gorillas and chimpanzees from a common ancestor, but that this was probably independently acquired. And of course, the whole issue of knuckle walking and other aspects of that might put together chimpanzees and gorillas as deriving these characteristics from a common ancestor would also have, of course, very serious implications for understanding our origins in the last common ancestor. How strong is the evidence today to say that that things like knuckle walking were not that are homoplasty, that they were not inherited by chimpanzees and gorillas from a common ancestor, and the whole idea that gorillas really are not just a very large type of chimpanzee, and this idea was around for a very long time. So how strong is the evidence that for this against that idea?
So it's not strong in one way or another, because what we need are fossil chimpanzees and gorillas to actually test this. And we don't have those fossils, and that's why I think it's so much discussion, because everything is based on what we do have today. And then the idea, on the one hand, like I myself, I just think homoplasty is like a very natural phenomenon in evolution of any group. And I think we are not special in that sense. And I just want to be open to that possibility. I think we just need more fossils, especially of chimpanzees and gorillas, to test this. But today, what we have are fossils of possible early hominins, and we have things like the hands of Australopithecus or Ardipithecus. and they don't exhibit those features that have been rated by other folks to be for being for knuckle walking, like the dorsal ridge in the capitates on the wrist bones, or the distal on the head of the metacarpals. So that's evidence that some researchers used to argue that those are very early, like something like Ardipithecus. It's very early hominin who don't have those traits. So perhaps ancestor was not knuckle walker. Okay. On the other hand, of course, wow, like there's a very particular type of locomotion, you know, and if both chimpanzees and gorillas do it, it makes sense to assume that the ancestor of the whole group also did it. But then this also builds on the idea that, as you mentioned, that gorillas are just enlarged chimpanzees that, you know, come like Stephen Jay Gould used to argue that, you know, that you scale a chimpanzee, you make a gorilla. But I would argue that that's an oversimplification, and I think that's the case for some features, such as the very basic aspects of the like, for example, if you like a female gorilla as a cranium that reminds that of a male chimpanzee, and it's expected that if you make something like that much bigger, like a male, like a silverback, some of the crests and insertions, they just become much bigger. This is just allometric effects. You know, you make bigger muscles, so some structures are evolving to sustain those morphologies that relate to being bigger. But if you have the same morphology at a smaller size, they will look similar to a chimpanzee. But then you look at other parts of the body, such as hand proportions, like, or wrist morphology, and they are not similar in chimpanzees and gorillas, or the pelvis length. Overall shape of a chimpanzee pelvis looks more like an orangutan pelvis than a gorilla pelvis. And actually, the pelvis of a gorilla, in terms of proportions, look more like primitive, like something like Australopithecus, perhaps, or even like Pyrrholopithecus, as far as we know. So, you know, it's just not as easy as say these gorillas are big chimpanzees, and they come from an ancestor that was mostly like a chimpanzee. Like, it maybe so for some features. Again, this is the idea of mosaic evolution. Some things might be some primitive features of the last common ancestor of chimpanzees and humans could be better preserved in living chimpanzees, such as some aspects of foot morphology or wrist morphology. But in terms of like length proportions of the forelimbs, of the hand, of the pelvis, actually those seem to be a little better preserved in gorillas, and gorillas show similarities on those features, on those relative lengths, to more primitive apes as well. So that already, and that's independent of the size. That if you, doesn't matter if you scale, you do ratios, you do regressions, that doesn't change. Gorillas, for many parts of their body, from the distance, I understand that group looks like if you need to choose what looks more like a gorilla today, you would of course choose a chimpanzee. But I don't think it's fair to say that it's just like a big chimpanzee. It has its own evolutionary history, its own features. Even there are several features on the faces of some fossil apes that look like a gorilla. And some researchers have claimed, oh, I found a fossil gorilla because they have a muscle that looks like a gorilla. Or perhaps gorillas preserve a facial morphology that is more primitive than other chimpanzees. And that's why it's similar to the fossil that you found. So it's really, again, we need to consider which features are derived towards something which are primitive. What is the value of those features functionally, phylogenetically, is really, really complex. And my whole idea defending here is that we need to be just aware of those limitations when we present an evolutionary scenario, and just be open-minded that there are alternatives today that we cannot really choose among. We can have our preference and point that out, but it's really not straightforward to decide which one is clearly supported today, because we just, again, we don't have fossil chimpanzees. We don't have skeleton of fossil chimpanzees or fossil gorillas. So we are inferring how the ancestor of chimpanzees and humans look like, and the whole group look like, based on fossils that predated, so for several millions of years, that event, and by hominins that are already in our side. So we have like a gap there of morphologies that we just don't have. That's why, going back again to, we need to combine what we see today with what was there before, and also keep in mind that maybe we're missing a lot of morphologies that we don't have fossils for yet.
So along those lines, there's a question from the public about you're saying that we need to and we would love to find more fossils, but especially fossils of gorillas and chimpanzees. So one of the questions that we have is why are we currently lacking a fossil ape record in equatorial Africa? Is preservation a problem in these environments, or is it just a case of we haven't looked in the right areas?
Yes. So I think it's a combination of both. Of course, there are views out there that know that we do have those fossils. You know, the groups that believe that, for example, those Dryopid apes from Europe are part of the African ape and human clade. They argue that we don't have them in Africa because they were just not there. They were in Europe and then came back to Africa later on. But I think that is just based on, because this is the fossils that they have, I'm gonna put them in the spot. They are gonna give them a star role in this. And I do think that it's not that we have an incredible fossil record of vertebrate fossils in the middle, late, and late Miocene of Africa. And we have all kinds of animals, but we're so unlucky that we're not finding these fossil apes. No, that's not the case. We just don't have sites of that time period. Pun intended. You know, we just don't have them. I've been looking for them. I've been in Africa in strange places with geologists from different countries, and they're like, we don't have those. We don't know of the existence of those sediments. There are very few spots that where you can look at today, and maybe there are more spots to look at. I'm sure they are, but we just, you know, we don't know. Maybe we have not identified them yet. There are places that are largely unexplored from a paleontological viewpoint, and it's for a good reason, because some places are countries that are just hard to get there. There are political conflicts. No one wants to really be there. Even the people who live there don't want to be there, so don't go there. Or there are, if you look at the modern range of distribution of chimpanzees and gorillas, largely some sort of heavily dense forest is really, I mean, it's been shown that you can find some fossils there, but it's not as easy as walking somewhere like in the far region, where you just walk around and you can see things on the surface. It's very hard for fossils just to fossilize as compared to another area. So I think it's a combination of, if the ancestors of chimpanzees and gorillas live in the environment where they live today, it's going to be hard to find, because even if they did fossilize there, it's covered by vegetation today. How are we going to find them? No, but also maybe there are also some spots that we just haven't looked at yet.
And a related question, Sergio, has to do not so much with the apes themselves, but with the environments in which they lived. And how well do we even understand the history, the evolutionary history of the ecosystems in which these apes would have lived? In other words, I think you've mentioned we have the tropical forest today, but how well do we know the history and biogeography of this forest going back into the Miocene? And wouldn't this also be of central importance in understanding the dispersal patterns between Europe and Africa?
I think this is a great question for you. No, I think this is exactly right. That is key, and I think that topic is heavily understudied as compared to more like recent times for hominin sites, especially Pleistocene and Pleistocene. And I know that you and your team are looking into this today, so I look forward to what you find. But I think, as compared to like later hominin evolution, that time period is just less is understudied, really. What do you think?
I know, I completely agree that that's one of the big gaps, I think, in our knowledge. I mean, there are good sites again with fossil leaves in parts of the rift. There's some in Kenya from the late Miocene, but from vast regions of Africa, we just don't have any direct evidence for past environments. Although in some of the big river deltas, we get deposits that have been studied where you essentially are looking at huge drainage areas like the Congo or the Niger River that have been depositing sediments in the ocean, just off the delta, for millions of years, and people can study the pollen and other aspects of the past environments from these sites. But the issue there is that you're looking at a whole drainage that covers typically vast areas. So for any particular place, it's we lack these localized settings to understand better what was going on. So yeah, I agree. That's a big hole, and I cannot give you any good answers now, but this is an area that I've been thinking about in terms of how to analyze, how to get better data, how to work on that.
No, I think evolution happens in the environment as the environment change, and we need is part of the same, or it's part of the puzzle, and we just don't have the fossils, don't know much about those sites of that time period in Africa or how they look like, and a lot of what we know is based on what we see today, and I think we need to be aware that things today are not like they were then, and we need data to do the reconstructions, and some of that data is not available yet.
And again, staying on the topic of hominine, so African ape ancestors, how strong is the evidence for something like Chororopithecus being in the gorilla lineage? Is that something that?
So I'm not saying it was not a gorilla or part of the gorilla lineage, but it's so fragmentary, just like isolated broken crowns of teeth, that just, even if it is, it's not going to tell us much about gorilla evolution. We need different parts of the body, ideally some partial skeletons. We need more. Other folks, based on cladistic analysis of what we do have, those partial crowns, think that it's not enough derived features to put them there yet. And they just consider as a Certida said, it's taxon, like it's not clear what it falls yet. We just don't have enough distinctive traits. And if you look at the original study of those teeth in nature, actually looking at the plots, the fossil falls a lot of the times in overlapping morphospace regions of gorillas and other things. So in the end, the conclusion that it's part of the gorilla lineage is based on the crests on the surface. So if we assume that those crests only evolve that kind of gorilla-like crest only evolve once, then, but it's again, we're falling into the if. We just don't know. Again, I'm not saying, I don't saying yes or no. I'm saying we need more. We need more, because even if we found, even if we had found like a whole, like raw teeth, and it just looks like a living gorilla in every sense and distinctive from any other ape, that okay, we have a gorilla this time that the teeth look already like a modern gorilla, probably was eating like modern gorillas eat, although that's very complex because even living gorillas eat very different things depending where they are. So even if we had that, we still don't know much about the whole animal. It's like with Gigantopithecus, we have mandibles, teeth, but we just don't know how it looked like yet.
That's another big puzzle, a very interesting one. Now staying on the European origin idea, Sergio, I wanted to ask you about you've discussed it, the idea that hominins would have a European origin, and I want to ask you whether this whole scenario makes sense evolutionarily, biogeographically, because the idea, if I may be oversimplifying, but is that we have dispersal of African apes towards Europe. Then in Europe, they continue to evolve. In Europe, they become more hominin-like based on some key adaptations. And then sort of they disperse back into Africa, where they become hominins, or perhaps as hominins. But that would imply then that that meanwhile in Africa, essentially the whole ape radiation went extinct. Is that an oversimplification of the European origin scenario? And
No, I think you summarized it pretty well. I personally don't agree. I don't think it's supported by much evidence. To begin with, they become more hominin-like over time. I don't see that either. Like, I discussed this several times with the proponents of that view, and I like the apes that evolve locally in Eurasia become more and more over time modern hominoid-like, in the sense that they develop adaptations for an orthograde body plan, for being better climbers, better suspensory apes, but they don't look necessarily more like a gorilla, more like a chimpanzee, or even more like an orangutan. They just look more like what the survivors who had today look like from the distance, but not in any of the details. And in the review, my colleagues and I pointed out that some of the similarities that basically relate to being better adapted for arboreal locomotion is something that might have evolved independently several times, because probably the adaptations that allow those apes to leave Africa in the middle Miocene related to be able to move in open environments and do long distances. And then with the same changes in the environment that happened in Africa happen also in some regions of Europe. Europe was Central Europe, Northeast Spain was covered. The idea is that it was covered by some like forest corridor, allowing these apes to move around. That's why in Spain there are no fossil apes anywhere else in the peninsula. And we have plenty of Miocene sites with incredible fossils. No fossil apes, only Northeast Spain, Central Europe, like all the way tracking down to Turkey, Greece. So basically coming out of Africa and going through that forest corridor. It seems that the same changes in the environment that were happening in Africa were probably happening in Europe. And then so the apes that were surviving, they were evolving to be more and more adapted to live in those forests. And it's just natural that they evolve more and more adaptations for enhanced suspensory behaviors, for example. But that's something that is happening in many other times. It's happening in some New World monkeys, like the atelines. It's happening in some subfossil lemurs in Madagascar. It just happens. We know that that's happened plenty of times. If you are an animal that's gonna specialize in arboreal locomotion, you are in this kind of eclectic arboreal locomotion, you're gonna develop those particular features. So to that point, one point is that I don't think there's evidence that those fossil apes from Europe are becoming more African ape-like over time. That's one. Any other classic analysis outside that team to defend that don't find the same results. They never fall in the African ape and human clade in the classic analysis. They fall probably like just at the base of the whole great ape and human clade as something basal. So probably they were like, I think it's more evidence suggesting that it's part of it's close to the ancestor or close to the node of all the living great apes, but not necessarily within any of those. So again, I think that we just don't have the sites yet in Africa. We're not identified them yet. It would be very strange that all apes become extinct from Africa. Especially if you look at a map of localities of that time period in Africa, you see that there's a bias there. We don't have most of Africa covered whatsoever.
Very much agree with that assessment. We have another question here from our viewers, and thank you for a great talk. Thank you, they say. And the question is, how would you interpret locomotion from hand and foot fossils? If new fossils are found, what would you expect to see if the species were bipedal?
That's a good question, because usually what we do is compared to living things, right? So the food, for example, we try to see if it was a biped, and we have a fossil food. It's more like any living ape that we have today, or it's more like a modern human. So, I mean, that's a good start, but we're at risk. We're at risk of like both modern human feet and modern hominid feet might have changed from that ancestor. So just assuming that one is the derived, the different one, ours, and the modern apes are the primitive. It could be for, I think it is the case for overall like foot proportions and shape of the different ankle bones, like in the case of chimpanzees and gorillas, I think one or the other preserves some primitive features. But I think the ancestor of human and chimpanzees was not exactly like a chimpanzee in the foot or like a gorilla, but it has some aspects were more like a gorilla, some other aspects were more like a chimpanzee, some other aspects such as, this is based on my own study with a former student, such as in the metatarsals, could be actually better represented in fossil apes or even some terrestrial monkeys today. So I think what I would do is to make very broad comparisons, including the modern humans, but also modern hominoids and also fossil hominoids, other primates that we know, oh, those are more terrestrial, or those are more arboreal. We know because they're alive today and we can see. And then also through some fossils, through early hominins, things that some, like Australopithecus afarensis, that we know, everyone, there is no discussion whether or not it's a hominin, there's no discussion whether or not it was biped to a large degree because the morphology is already pretty derived towards modern human morphology. And then also some fossil apes that lived before the split of chimpanzees and humans. And then if you can see a clear patterns, then you can evaluate where the fossil falls. If we, let's say, just compare with modern African apes, modern chimpanzees, and it is a little closer to humans, we're going for, oh, it's a biped. But perhaps if we throw there some fossil apes that are so old that they probably were not biped, but they look more like a monkey, maybe those are actually closer to the fossil that you just found. But if you don't include those in the comparison, it's hard to tell. So basically my advice is this bottom up and top down all together. Just put as much as you can always together to have a more informed picture.
Yeah, very good point. And you mentioned monkeys a couple of times, and you know, the bottom up and top down approaches, I think, are complementary, as you say, but somewhat related. Of course, the group that is nearest evolutionarily to the apes are the old world monkeys, and these have a pretty good fossil record, especially in the Pleistocene of Africa. Do you see any parallels between the radiation of the Miocene apes and the radiation of monkeys, Cercopithecus, a little bit later? And are there processes or patterns that we can derive from the evolution of monkeys that can help us think about the evolution of hominoids?
Absolutely. I think studying any primate is going to provide us good examples, but our monkeys are clearly an example of, we have this diversity of apes in the Miocene. We have plenty of fossil apes in the early Miocene, middle Miocene. Towards the end of the Miocene, they kind of start going down, less and less and less. And that's the time where our monkeys start to like diversify and to take over, basically. I don't think that's a coincidence. And it's at the same time when you start seeing these more specialized ape forms that are more adapted for eclectic arboreal behavior, such as vertical climbing or suspension. I think it's a clear relationship that we have these primitive looking apes before that kind of look like a monkey, and they're kind of widespread, and there are many, it's a lot of, there are many taxa, many species, and then they start declining, and then we have these monkeys spreading, diversifying, and the only apes that we start seeing and finding fossils and the ones that we see today are the weird ones, the ones that have evolved towards specialized arboreal locomotion. And it's clearly is part of a one process of changes in the environment, and we have almost no fossil monkeys. They take over. Those more generalized apes disappear, and only the specialized ones survive because those are the ones that can compete with the monkeys. That's something that this is not based on my own research. It's based on other people's research, and we discussed that in the review. But that's what I think. I think it's clearly essential to study that single process because it's one thing. I think they are not independent events.
Okay, Sergio, we'll ask another question from our viewers. What are your thoughts on the waterside ape theory as an explanation for the adaptation of bipedalism?
I know the researchers behind those ideas are very insistent. Every time a paper comes out, everyone receives an email from them saying this fits perfectly my story. And yes, but again, my point is, I would say to that theory and to other theories, like just because you can put together a good story based on what we have doesn't mean that's what happened. And especially if it's something that we cannot really test, because how can you test that that was the case? Like I understand that there are some features that define modern humans today, such as having the fat, in the dermis, and that all you see, and the lack of most large amount of less hair in the bodies is something that you see in aquatic mammals. So I see that, but so that's I guess being constructive, I would say it's another possibility, but I think the defenders of that view are falling into the just so story trap, which is that every single discovery, every single fossil, always it's after the fact fitted into that narrative, no matter what. I know from personal experience, no matter if my research is about how the thumb become wider in hominids to be better at manipulation, people of that team would argue that's because it's better for propulsion when you're swimming. And it just, if you bring that to an extreme, you would argue the human hand has evolved specifically to play video games. Have you seen how well like a PlayStation controller fits my hand and the proportions of my thumb? It clearly has evolved to use that control remote, right? And I think it's just, we need to be very careful. Like, it's not fair to just have an hypothesis, an evolutionary scenario that doesn't change no matter what new fossils or evidence appear. It never changes. It's just fitted after the fact to perfectly match the story. Doesn't mean the story is not good, because again, this is something we should be, I think most people is aware of, but some people seem not to be aware of the fact that when we work in historical sciences, and until someone like invents a time machine, we really don't know this. Even if we find the perfect evolutionary scenario, which are with 100 hypotheses that can be all tested, and none of them can be refuted and support that particular evolutionary scenario, whatever it is, we still cannot be sure, because we can never go back to actually see what happened. And we should always remain aware of that big challenge.
So that was the aquatic idea, and you started out with the mentioning that you like good stories, and went on to essentially say that the East Side story is incorrect, and I think we're coming to a point where we can have a pretty good idea of hypotheses that are probably incorrect, but we don't really have any one sort of overarching hypothesis to replace these with. Is that correct?
No, I think some hypotheses can be discarded. Yes, but I'm not the hypothesis itself, but the evolutionary scenario. So basically, but again, it depends how many. Just because one hypothesis is falsified doesn't mean the whole evolutionary scenario should be taken not into consideration anymore. But when there are many, when there are more that cannot be supported than the ones that can be supported, it doesn't mean that it still doesn't mean that the evolutionary scenario didn't happen. It means that we should start worrying about that maybe there is something else that happened. And I'm not saying the East Side story is not what happened. I'm just saying that when it came out, it was based on what we had then. It made total sense. It was it made sense what we have. The modernized distribution, where the earliest hominids were found. But today, we have fossils in other places and from different ages that don't give support to that. So doesn't mean it didn't happen. It means that perhaps that is something else that happened. And I think we are now in one of those situations that were described by Kuhn as a crisis in the paradigm, which is, I think, it's an exciting time to be, meaning that we are finding so much new fossils and genetic evidence and behavioral evidence and sites that clearly the old paradigms are in a crisis, and we should figure out a new one. What the new one is, I'm like you and many other colleagues that were working on it, and I think that's good. We should not. It's okay. Maybe we end up, by accident or not, giving support to the old ones or a previous one before the East Side story. I don't know, but it's clearly that paradigm that seems still to be pretty prevalent. It's in crisis right now, and I don't know. We'll see where it goes. But I think it's exciting just to see what we have today and look, wow! Just in 30 years, we have all these new data now that tell us that perhaps something different from this would actually happen. Let's think about this with fresher eyes and look into new places that we were not looking before and see what we find and so on.
Thank you, Sergio. Let me, we've gone on for quite some time, so let me finish soon. But I would like to ask the last two questions interrelated. You've talked about exploring for new sites in various parts of Africa, and you've talked about time machines. And the first question is, out of the places that you've been going to or you would like to go to, in an ideal world, what would you like to find and where? And related to that, let's get your time machine and you can choose to go to one place at one period of time in the past. Where would you go?
Well, the time would be, again, like somewhere in this 9 to 6 time frame, and I would go to Africa. Like, I think that's where the split happened. And then what would I like to see? Like anything. If any hominoid that we see at that time, either if it's a fossil gorilla, then it would not be a fossil, but even if it was a part of the lineage of the gorillas or the chimpanzees or the part of the ancestral population from which chimpanzees and humans evolved, it doesn't matter. I like to see how it looks like. It looked like exactly like a gorilla, it looked like exactly like a chimpanzee, it looked like something else that I was not expecting whatsoever. I would be, that would be interesting no matter what. So, it would be very hard unless you can take genetic samples to take back and study exactly where this thing I saw falls. I guess it's possible if I had that time machine. That would be ideal. But anything, that was going on in Africa, around the Eastern Rift Valley, at the end of the Miocene would be incredible. But also West Africa or South Africa. I'm sure there were apes there too, and we just cannot imagine what was going on there. Or maybe we find, I see a fossil that we have today that was moving in a completely different way of what we thought based on the bones. Well, this clear example, mental experiment from Craig Stanford. If you basically pointed out, imagine the modern chimpanzees, they're not alive. No one has ever seen a living chimpanzee. And some paleontologists find a complete articulated skeleton of a chimpanzee of the Miocene. Would we reconstruct chimpanzees the way they are today? Would we reconstruct them as knuckle walking most of the time on the ground? Or were we just looking at the morphology, overall morphology, to say, oh, this is clearly a super suspensory apius, or they hang in the branches? Probably not. What's making using stone tools, flaking things by accident? It's just so much that it would be impossible to know just from the fossils. It's so much context. That's why we need to better understand the living as well, the environment. It's a lot of work to be done, and I think that's exciting.
Well, thank you so much, Sergio. Muchas gracias. It's been a an amazing talk, very thought-provoking, and I'd like to thank all of you listening and watching the discussion. Thank you for your participation and your questions. And I invite all of you to join us again next week for our next Primate Conversations and for the following talks during the rest of the term. But again, many, many thanks, Sergio, for a wonderful talk. And I will encourage those who have not read your piece in Science yet to have a look at it, because it is a very, very thoughtful, very well written piece of work. So thank you so much. We will finish the live transmission now. But
thank you, Rene, and thank you, everyone.
Okay. Bye-bye. Thank you. I'm going to switch to speakers.